My name is Sloane Montgomery. I'm 29, and last Sunday's family brunch destroyed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the people who raised me. What started as their usual mockery of my inappropriate genes ended with me holding the deed to their precious Riverside Country Club, the very place they'd used to humiliate me for years. The shock on their faces when I revealed I was their new landlord was nothing compared to what happened next. 20 years of subtle cruelty, social manipulation, and financial control came crashing down in a single moment that would reshape our family forever. But before we dive into how I dismantled their perfect little world, where are you watching from today? If you're ready for a story about family karma that'll make you question everything about blood loyalty, smash that like button. And subscribe for more revenge stories that prove sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. Trust me, you won't believe how this ends. Growing up as Sloane Montgomery meant living under a microscope of judgment that never seemed to focus clearly. My parents, Charles and Victoria Montgomery, had built their entire identity around appearances, social status, and what they called maintaining standards. Our family's reputation in the community was their religion, and I was apparently their biggest disappointment. The Riverside Country Club had been their sanctuary for over 2 decades. Every weekend they'd dress in their finest attire and parade through those mahogany halls like royalty, greeting fellow members with practiced smiles and calculated conversations. They thrived on the exclusivity, the waiting lists, the subtle power plays that came with membership in the city's most prestigious social club. I remember being 12 years old, desperately wanting to fit into their world. I'd saved my allowance for months to buy what I thought was an appropriate dress for the club's annual charity gala. When I showed it to my mother, her face crumpled with disgust. "Sloane, darling, this is exactly why we need to work on your presentation." She'd said the word presentation, dripping with disappointment. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define our relationship for the next 17 years. Nothing I did was ever quite right for their standards. My grades weren't from the right subjects. My friends weren't from the right families. My interests weren't refined enough. My career choices weren't impressive enough for their social circle. When I graduated college with a degree in business administration, they barely acknowledged it because it wasn't from an Ivy League school. When I got my first job at a tech startup, they introduced me to their friends as still figuring things out. When I bought my first apartment, they criticized the neighborhood as up and coming, which was their polite way of saying beneath us. The clothes became their favorite target. Every family gathering turned into a fashion critique session where my choices were dissected and found wanting. "Sloane, you can't wear that to the club," became my mother's favorite phrase. It didn't matter if we weren't even going to the club, she'd use it as a measuring stick for everything. I learned to hate that place before I ever really understood what it represented. To me, Riverside Country Club wasn't just a building. It was the symbol of everything I could never be good enough for. It was where my parents went to feel superior, where they gathered with like-minded people who valued appearances over authenticity, status over substance. But what really stung was how they talked about me to their friends. I'd overhear conversations where they'd apologize for my choices, explain away my phase, or make excuses for why I wasn't meeting their expectations. They spoke about me like I was a project that had gone wrong, a investment that hadn't paid off the way they'd hoped. The financial control started subtly. They'd offer to pay for things, clothes, shopping, dinners, trips, but only if I met their conditions. "We'll cover your vacation, but you'll need something more appropriate to wear. We'd love to take you to the symphony, but first let's find you a suitable dress." Every gift came with strings attached. Every gesture of generosity was really a transaction designed to mold me into their vision of an acceptable daughter. By my mid-20s, I'd learned to keep my distance. Sunday brunches became obligatory performances where I'd show up, endure their commentary, and leave feeling smaller than when I'd arrived. They'd spend these meals discussing club events I wasn't invited to, name-dropping friends I'd never meet, and making passive-aggressive comments about my life choices. The worst part was how they'd use the club as leverage. The Hendersons' daughter just made partner at her law firm, my father would say, cutting into his eggs Benedict. They're so proud. She fits right in at all the club events. The implication was always clear. Why couldn't I be more like the other members' children? I started working extra hours, taking on side projects, anything to build my own financial independence. I refused their offers to help with rent or car payments, even when things got tight. I needed to prove to myself that I could succeed without their approval or their money. What I didn't realize was that this determination would eventually give me something they never expected: real power. The tech startup where I'd been working was acquired by a larger company when I was 26. My stock options, which I'd barely understood when I'd accepted them, suddenly became worth more money than I'd ever imagined. Instead of celebrating, I quietly invested it, started my own consulting firm, and began building the kind of wealth that didn't require anyone's approval. My parents knew I was doing well. I'd stopped asking for anything and started picking up dinner checks, but they assumed I was just getting by. They had no idea that their disappointment of a daughter was actually building an empire, one strategic investment at a time. The Riverside Country Club wasn't just a place, it was an entire ecosystem designed to reinforce social hierarchies and maintain the status quo. I learned this not from being inside it, but from watching how it shaped my parents' every interaction with the world around them. The club operated on unwritten rules that were more powerful than any posted regulations. Members spoke in code using phrases like "our kind of people" and maintaining the community character to describe their exclusionary practices. They'd discuss potential new members during their tennis matches and golf rounds, dissecting applicants' backgrounds, professions, and family histories like scientists examining specimens. My mother had perfected the art of club politics. She served on the events committee, which gave her influence over who got invited to exclusive gatherings. She'd spend hours on the phone with other committee members, strategically planning seating arrangements and guest lists that reinforced existing power structures while carefully excluding anyone who didn't meet their unspoken criteria. The financial barrier to entry was just the beginning. Yes, the initiation fees and monthly dues were substantial, but the real cost was the constant pressure to maintain appearances. Members were expected to participate in charity auctions, sponsor events, and contribute to various club causes. My parents would spend thousands each month just to maintain their standing, treating it like a necessary business expense for their social lives. I watched how the club membership affected their relationship with money. They'd skimp on home repairs or delay replacing their aging car, but they'd never miss a club assessment or event fee. Their priorities were completely warped by the need to maintain their position in this artificial hierarchy. The dress codes were particularly revealing. The club had different requirements for different areas and times of day, but these rules were selectively enforced based on who was breaking them. Established members could bend the rules with impunity, while newer or less influential members were politely corrected for minor infractions. The real message wasn't about appropriate attire, it was about knowing your place. My parents had internalized these dynamics so completely that they'd begun applying club standards to every aspect of their lives. They'd judge restaurants by whether club members would approve of them. They'd evaluate my accomplishments by whether they'd sound impressive during club conversations. Their entire worldview had been filtered through the lens of this exclusive institution. The networking aspect was what kept them hooked. Business deals were discussed over martinis, investment opportunities were shared during bridge games, and professional connections were forged on the golf course. The club wasn't just their social life, it was integral to their financial security and professional standing. But I also saw the anxiety that came with this lifestyle. There was constant worry about losing face, about saying the wrong thing, about falling behind in the endless competition for status and recognition. My parents lived in fear of being excluded from events or losing their good standing. They'd rather go into debt than risk their club membership. The children of members were expected to follow certain paths. They should attend specific schools, pursue appropriate careers, marry within acceptable circles, and eventually become members themselves. I was a deviation from this script, a reminder that their perfect system wasn't as foolproof as they'd believed. During my college years, I'd started paying closer attention to the club's business operations. When I'd visit my parents, I'd notice things: staffing issues, maintenance problems, financial stress. The club was struggling to maintain its facilities while keeping membership affordable for long-term members. They were caught between needing revenue and maintaining exclusivity. I researched the club's ownership structure and discovered it was technically a member-owned cooperative, but the real estate and buildings were owned by a separate corporation that leased the property to the club. The lease agreement was coming up for renewal, and there were rumors about potential rent increases that would force the club to either raise dues significantly or relocate. This information fascinated me from a business perspective. The club's leadership was made up of members who were successful in their own fields but had little experience managing hospitality or real estate operations. They were vulnerable to exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'd been developing in my consulting work. I started attending public meetings about local development, learning about zoning changes and property values in the club's neighborhood. I discovered that several nearby properties had been sold recently to developers who were transforming the area into mixed-use commercial spaces. The club was sitting on extremely valuable real estate that wasn't being utilized to its full potential. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents continued to deteriorate. They'd given up on trying to change me and had moved into a phase of resigned disappointment. They'd make comments about my choices with the weary tone of people who'd accepted defeat. "Sloane has her own ideas about success," my mother would tell her friends, as if I were a rebellious teenager rather than a successful adult. The irony wasn't lost on me that while they were struggling to maintain their position in an institution that didn't really value them, I was building real wealth and influence in the world outside their bubble. But they couldn't see it because it didn't fit their narrow definition of achievement. Everything changed 6 months ago when I received a call from Marcus Webb, a commercial real estate broker I'd worked with on several investment deals. He had information about a distressed property that might interest me, a prime piece of real estate with significant development potential but complicated ownership issues that were keeping other investors away. "It's the Riverside Country Club property," he said, and I nearly dropped my phone. "The corporation that owns the land is facing bankruptcy. The founding family has been hemorrhaging money for years and they need to sell quickly. The club itself has right of first refusal, but they can't come up with the capital." I told Marcus I'd call him back, but my mind was already racing. This was the opportunity I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire adult life. I could buy the property that housed the institution that had defined my parents' values and in turn their treatment of me. I spent the next 2 weeks conducting the most thorough due diligence of my career. I analyzed the property's financial history, studied the lease agreements, researched comparable sales in the area, and consulted with lawyers about the legal implications of the purchase. The numbers were better than I'd hoped. The club was locked into a lease that ran for another 5 years, but it included clauses that would allow the new owner to renegotiate terms under certain circumstances. More importantly, the property was zoned for mixed-use development, meaning I could potentially transform parts of it while maintaining the club's operations. I also discovered something that made me laugh out loud when I read it. The lease included a provision that required the club to maintain certain standards of operation and membership diversity. The previous owners had never enforced this clause, but as the new owner, I would have significant leverage over how the club operated. The asking price was substantial more money than my parents had probably ever seen in one place, but it was within my reach. The combination of my startup windfall, successful consulting business, and strategic investments had given me liquid assets that even I sometimes found hard to believe. But before I could move forward, I needed to understand exactly what buying this property would mean for my relationship with my parents and their entire social circle. This wasn't just a real estate investment. It was potentially a nuclear bomb that would destroy the ecosystem they'd spent decades building. I called my lawyer, Sarah Chen, who'd helped me structure several business deals. Sarah, I need you to walk me through something, and I need complete honesty about the risks. What kind of risks are we talking about? She asked. The kind where I buy my parents' country club and become their landlord. There was a long pause. Sloane, that's either brilliant or completely insane. Possibly both. We spent 3 hours on the phone discussing the legal, financial, and personal implications. From a business perspective, it was a solid investment with multiple exit strategies. From a personal perspective, it was declaring war on my family's value system. Sarah helped me understand that as the property owner, I'd have substantial influence over the club's operations without actually running day-to-day activities. I could enforce lease terms, require operational changes, and even influence membership policies. The club's board would have to work with me on any major decisions affecting the property. The question, Sarah said, is what you want to accomplish. If this is just about making money, there are easier investments. If this is about something else, you need to be clear about your objectives. I spent 2 sleepless nights thinking about her question. What did I want to accomplish? Was this revenge, justice A, teaching moment? Or was I just tired of feeling powerless in the face of my parents' judgment? The truth was complicated. I wanted them to understand that their values were arbitrary and their judgment was meaningless. I wanted them to see that the daughter they'd considered a disappointment had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But I also wanted to prove to myself that I could take control of the situation that had controlled me for so long. I made the decision on a Thursday morning while sitting in my office, looking out at the city skyline. I called Marcus and told him to draft an offer. I would buy the Riverside Country Club property, but I wanted the transaction structured to close with maximum impact. The purchase process took 6 weeks of negotiations, inspections, and legal documentation. I insisted on complete confidentiality until the closing, which meant the club's leadership knew the property was being sold but had no idea who the buyer was. They were operating under the assumption that it would be another investment group that would maintain the status quo. During this period, I continued attending family events and listening to my parents discuss their concerns about the club's future. They were worried about potential changes, increased dues, or even closure. I sat through these conversations maintaining perfect poker face while knowing I held all the cards. The irony was delicious. They'd spent years making me feel excluded from their world, and now I was about to own the very foundation of that world. But I wasn't ready to reveal my hand yet. I wanted the moment to be perfect, unavoidable, and absolutely devastating to their assumptions about power and control. That's when I decided that Sunday brunch would be the perfect stage for this revelation. The timing couldn't have been more perfect: peak social hour, maximum audience, and the exact setting where they'd criticized my appearance countless times before. I wanted them to understand that the place they'd used to make me feel small now belonged to me. Sunday morning arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind of day that made the Riverside Country Club's outdoor terrace irresistible to its members. I chose my outfit carefully, not to meet their standards, but to deliberately fall short of them. Dark jeans with subtle tears at the knees, a fitted black t-shirt, and combat boots that would click assertively against the club's marble floors. The exact ensemble they'd criticize. I arrived at the club 15 minutes early, which gave me time to walk through the property with fresh eyes. Now that I owned every brick, every carefully manicured hedge, every crystal chandelier, the space felt completely different. I wasn't an unwelcome visitor anymore. I was the landlord conducting an inspection. The hostess, a young woman named Jennifer, whom I'd seen working there for years, greeted me with the polite smile reserved for a member's family. "Good morning, Miss Montgomery. Your parents are already seated on the terrace." "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "could you let me know when the club manager arrives today? I need to schedule a meeting with him this week." Jennifer looked confused. "Oh, Mr. Patterson is here now. He's in his office if you need to speak with him about an event or perfect. Could you ask him to stop by our table when he has a moment? It's regarding the property lease." Her confusion deepened, but she nodded professionally. I could see her trying to process why a member's daughter would be discussing lease agreements, but she was too well trained to ask questions. I made my way to the terrace where my parents were already deep in conversation with another couple I recognized as the Harrisons' longtime club members and family friends. My mother's face tightened almost imperceptibly when she saw my outfit, a reaction so automatic she probably wasn't even conscious of it anymore. "Sloane, darling," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that mixed affection with disappointment, "I was hoping you'd wear that lovely blue dress we bought you for Easter." "This is more comfortable," I replied, settling into my chair and reaching for the mimosa that had been waiting for me. My father, Charles, barely looked up from his conversation with Robert Harrison about golf handicaps and the upcoming club tournament. The Harrisons' presence was actually perfect for what I had planned. They represented exactly the kind of audience that would make this revelation maximum impact. "Robert was just telling us about the concerns the board is having about the property sale," my mother said clearly, trying to steer the conversation away from my fashion choices. "It's all very mysterious. No one knows who bought it." Mrs. Harrison leaned forward conspiratorially. "I heard it might be one of those development companies that turns everything into condominiums. Can you imagine? This place could be gone within a year." "Now, Margaret, let's not panic," my father said, but I could hear the worry in his voice. "The new owner has to honor the existing lease. We have 5 years of security minimum." Still, Robert Harrison continued, things could change dramatically. "New ownership always brings new rules, new priorities. What if they decide to raise the rent so high that we can't afford to stay here?" I sipped my mimosa and watched the anxiety ripple around the table. These people had built their entire social identity around this place, and the thought of losing it terrified them. They were discussing their future like prisoners, debating whether their new warden would be cruel or merely indifferent. "I'm sure whoever bought it understands the value of maintaining the club's traditions," my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. That's when I noticed Mr. Patterson, the club manager, approaching our table. He was a nervous-looking man in his 50s who'd always seemed overwhelmed by the demands of managing such a high-maintenance membership. Today, he looked particularly stressed. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the table. "Generally, I'm looking for Miss Sloane Montgomery. I received a message that you wanted to speak with me about the lease." The conversation stopped. Every face at the table turned to look at me with varying degrees of confusion. My parents looked particularly puzzled. Why would their disappointing daughter be discussing lease agreements with the club manager? "Yes," I said, standing up. "Mr. Patterson, I think we should probably sit down with the full board this week to discuss the transition process. There are several operational changes I'd like to implement, and I want to make sure everyone's on the same page." "I'm sorry," my father interrupted, "but what exactly are you talking about, Sloane, Mr.?" Patterson looked between my father and me, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Montgomery, I assumed you knew. Miss Montgomery is the new property owner. She bought the club's real estate last Friday." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the fountain in the club's main lobby through the open terrace doors. My mother's mimosa glass stopped halfway to her lips. My father's face went through several color changes. The Harrisons looked like they were watching a tennis match, their heads swiveling between my parents and me. "I'm sorry," my mother finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Could you repeat that I bought the property?" I said, sitting back down and taking another sip of my mimosa. The Riverside Country Club now pays rent to Montgomery Holdings LLC. That's my company. My father found his voice first. That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. Actually, I do. Turns out all those years you spent worrying about my career choices, I was building something you couldn't see. Something bigger than what you thought success should look like. Mrs. Harrison was the first to understand the implications. You mean, you're our new landlord? That's exactly what I mean. And Margaret, you'll be happy to know that I have no intention of turning this into condominiums. I think the club serves an important purpose in the community, though there will be some changes to how it operates. The aftermath of my revelation unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of shock, denial, and desperate attempts to regain control. My parents sat frozen their brunch untouched while the Harrisons excused themselves with polite mumbles about urgent appointments. The news would spread through the club's membership like wildfire, and everyone knew it. Mr. Patterson, caught between his old assumptions and his new reality, tried to maintain professional composure. Miss Montgomery, perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting to discuss the transition. Of course, I said, pulling out my phone and opening my calendar app. How about Tuesday morning? I'd like to review the club's operational procedures, membership policies, and that interesting diversity clause in the lease agreement that hasn't been enforced in recent years. My father's face went pale. The diversity clause was something the original property owners had insisted on decades ago, but it had become a dead letter under the previous ownership. Every member at this table knew the club's demographics were far from diverse, despite the legal requirement. Sloane, my mother said, her voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before, surely you're not planning to? To change things dramatically, I'm planning to ensure the club operates in accordance with its lease agreement, I replied. All provisions of the lease agreement. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat nervously. I should probably return to my office and begin preparing the necessary documentation for our meeting, if you'll excuse me. After he left, my parents and I sat in heavy silence. Around us, other club members were beginning to notice that something significant had happened at our table. I could see heads turning, whispered conversations, starting the social network that my parents valued so highly beginning to buzz with speculation. How long have you been planning this? My father asked finally. I wasn't planning it at all, I said honestly. The opportunity came up 6 weeks ago and I realized I had the resources to make it happen. It seemed like poetic justice. Poetic justice. My mother's voice rose slightly. Sloane, this is our life. This club isn't just some business investment for us. It's where we've built our relationships, our community, your identity. I finished. I know. I've watched you build your entire sense of self around belonging to this place. I've watched you judge me and everyone else by whether we met the standards of this institution. I've listened to you apologize for my existence to these people for 20 years. My father leaned forward, his business instincts finally kicking in. What do you want, money? Is this some kind of elaborate negotiation? I want you to understand something, I said, meeting his eyes directly. I want you to understand that the daughter you've been disappointed in for my entire adult life has more real power than anyone else sitting at this table. More power than anyone in this club, actually. The weight of this statement settled over them like a heavy blanket. I could see them processing not just the immediate situation, but everything it represented about the assumptions they'd made, about success, about me, about their own place in the world. The truth is, I continued, I don't need your approval anymore. I don't need your money, your connections, or your validation. I've built something bigger than this place, and I did it while you were busy being embarrassed by my genes. My mother set down her mimosa glass with shaking hands. So what happens now? Are you going to kick us out? Shut down the club, destroy everything we've worked for? I'm going to run a business, I said. A profitable, legally compliant, socially responsible business. If the club can adapt to operating under those standards, it will thrive. If it can't, I let the sentence hang in the air. Around us, I could feel the attention of other members who were trying to eavesdrop without appearing obvious about it. The social ecosystem my parents had spent decades navigating was watching their personal drama unfold in real time. There will be changes, I continued. The membership diversity requirements will be enforced. The financial transparency will improve. The staff will receive better wages and benefits. The facilities will be upgraded to modern standards. And yes, there will probably be some members who find these changes uncomfortable. My father was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. You've really thought this through. I've had my entire life to think about this place and what it represents, I said. The question is whether you're ready to accept that your disappointing daughter now controls the thing you've used to judge her worth. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah Chen, my lawyer, contract signed and filed. Congratulations on your new property. Hope your parents take it well, I showed them the message. My lawyer, I explained. She's been handling the legal aspects of the purchase. The final piece of their shock was realizing that this wasn't an impulsive decision or a lucky accident. This was the result of careful planning, substantial resources, and professional expertise, everything they'd assumed I lacked. I think my mother said slowly, we need to have a much longer conversation about this. I agree, I said, standing up from the table. But not here and not today. Today, I want you to sit in this place you've used as a weapon against me for 20 years and think about what it means that I now own it. I left them sitting there, walking through the club with my head held high, my combat boots clicking confidently against the marble floors. Members turned to watch me pass, some recognizing me as Charles and Victoria's daughter, others simply noticing the change in my demeanor. At the front desk, I stopped to speak with Jennifer. Could you make sure Mr. Patterson has my contact information, and let him know I'll want to review all membership applications from the past 5 years during our meeting Tuesday? Of course, Miss Montgomery, she said, and for the first time her tone carried genuine respect rather than polite obligation. As I walked to my car, I could see my parents through the terrace windows, still sitting in stunned silence at their table. The Harrisons had returned and were clearly pressing for details. Other members were beginning to approach their table, drawn by the obvious drama. By tomorrow, everyone would know. The club's social hierarchy had just been completely upended, and the person they'd all dismissed as Charles and Victoria's problematic daughter was now the most powerful person in their small, exclusive world. 6 months have passed since that unforgettable Sunday brunch, and the transformation has exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. The Riverside Country Club still exists, but it's become something entirely different, something better, more inclusive, and ironically more successful than it ever was under the old regime. The changes began immediately after our Tuesday meeting with Mr. Patterson and the board. I presented them with a comprehensive plan that honored the lease requirements while modernizing the club's operations. The diversity clause wasn't just enforced. It became central to our marketing and membership development strategy. We partnered with local professional organizations, cultural groups, and community leaders to attract members who brought new energy and perspectives to the club. Some longtime members left predictably. The Harrisons were among the first to cancel their membership, claiming the club was losing its character. What they really meant was that they were uncomfortable sharing space with people who didn't look like them or share their narrow worldview. Good riddance. But for every member we lost, we gained 3 new ones. Young professionals loved the updated facilities and modern approach to hospitality. Families appreciated the expanded children's programs and inclusive events. Business leaders found value in networking opportunities that reflected the actual diversity of our city's economy. The staff changes were particularly satisfying. I increased wages across the board, implemented comprehensive healthcare benefits, and created advancement opportunities that had never existed before. Jennifer, the hostess who'd first directed me to Mr. Patterson is now the club's events coordinator after we discovered her incredible talent for organization and member relations. My parents took 3 weeks to speak to me after the brunch revelation. When they finally called requesting a dinner meeting, I suggested we eat at the club. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. "We've been thinking a lot about what you said," my mother began carefully as we sat in the main dining room surrounded by a much more diverse crowd than would have been there 6 months earlier. And I prompted, "We owe you an apology," my father said, the words clearly difficult for him. "Not just for Sunday, but for years of not seeing what you were building. For measuring your success by our standards instead of recognizing your achievements on their own terms." It was a start, but I wasn't ready to let them off the hook completely. "Do you understand why this place became so important to me? Why owning it felt necessary?" "You wanted to prove a point," my mother said. "I wanted to take back power," I corrected. "This club was the weapon you used to make me feel inadequate for 20 years. Every criticism, every disappointed look, every suggestion that I wasn't meeting your standards, it all came back to whether I'd be acceptable to the people in this room." My father nodded slowly. "We made this place more important than our relationship with you. You made their approval more important than understanding who I actually am," I said. "You were so invested in their perception of our family that you couldn't see the successful independent woman I'd become." The conversation lasted 3 hours and covered territory we'd never explored before. They told me about their own insecurities, their fears about social standing, their belief that the club represented security and acceptance they'd never felt elsewhere. I shared the pain of feeling rejected by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. "We're rebuilding our relationship slowly, but it's on completely different terms now. They can't use financial leverage against me anymore. They can't threaten social consequences. They can't dismiss my choices as immature or inappropriate. For the first time in my adult life, we're meeting as equals." The club's financial performance has been remarkable. Revenue is up 40%. Membership satisfaction scores have never been higher, and we've been featured in 3 national publications as a model for modernizing exclusive institutions. The property value has increased substantially, making this one of the best investments I've ever made. But the real victory isn't financial, it's personal. I walk into this place now and feel pride instead of anxiety. I see staff members who earn living wages and members who represent the full spectrum of our community's talent and diversity. I've transformed an institution of exclusion into a space that actually serves its stated purpose of bringing people together. Last month, I was elected to the city's Economic Development Council partly based on the success of the club's transformation. I'm using that platform to push for more inclusive business practices across our community. The skills I developed fighting for acceptance in one small social circle have become tools for creating systemic change on a much larger scale. The irony of my success story isn't lost on me. The place that was supposed to represent everything I could never achieve became the foundation for success beyond anything my parents had imagined. The daughter they thought would never fit in anywhere became the person who redefined what fitting in could mean. My relationship with clothes has even changed. I still wear jeans to family events, but now it's a choice rather than a rebellion. When my mother comments on my outfit, it's usually to compliment how confident I look rather than to suggest improvements. Small victories matter. Speaking of family dynamics and karma, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who couldn't see your worth? Have you experienced that moment when people who underestimated you suddenly realized their mistake? Drop a comment below and share your own stories of family justice. Sometimes the best revenge really is success that speaks for itself. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of turning the tables on people who counted us out. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that other people's standards don't define our worth, and that sometimes the best way to change the game is to become the one who owns it. Thank you for watching, and remember the next time someone tries to make you feel small because of where you come from or how you look, just remember that tables can turn faster than they ever imagine. Your worth isn't determined by their approval, and your success doesn't need their permission. Sometimes the best life lessons come from family revenge stories that teach us the most powerful truth of all. We define our own value. Until next time, keep building your own empire on your own terms.